becoming more and more clear that that's what's happening, and the resistance started to grow, and by 1936, there was an Arab revolt in which the peasantry took up arms against the British, and it was crushed by the British military with 40,000 troops. And they disarmed the Palestinians by 1939, okay, by the beginning of World War II. Set this down. So here are our two movements, Zionism on the one hand and Palestinian nationalism on the other, both sort of taking their footing in the early part of the century, but by the 1930s, they had really started to pick up. Now, the tables were really turned, and the strength of Zionism and its movement from a kind of a fringe element to a more central idea comes to us with the World War II. And this is a map of Europe, and it's meant to explain something about what happened in Europe of the Holocaust. And essentially, to make, again, a huge, long story very brief, when a white supremacist, Aryan supremacist party, the Nazi Party, rose up in Germany, they instituted at first, which was a kind of a Jim Crow, an apartheid in Germany. They stripped Jews of their citizenship. They basically said, we're going to do to Jews here what's going on in America to black folks. Right? So you take away their citizenship, they get fired from their civil service jobs, you can't be teachers, you can't intermarry. It was very parallel in the early phase, Nuremberg laws of the early mid-30s, to what was going on in America. But when the war started, that anti-Jewishness, that Aryan supremacist, really got stepped up, especially when they started going into Eastern Europe, where most of the Jews were, like the invasion of Poland in 1939. And then it moved to detentions, to the ghettoization of Jews, moving them into tight ghettos in the cities, and then concentration camps, which are detention camps, and then later in the war, by 1942, 43, into death camps, where they just started to gas people. First they started firing squads, but there were too many people. It's too difficult to face people and shoot them down, although there were hundreds of thousands of people shot in the early parts of the war. By 42, they figured out they could do it in a more mechanized way with gas chambers and incinerating the bodies. And at the end of the war, this is a map that shows you where attacks happened. Those are, you can't see them too well, they're kind of like the stars, the Jewish ghettos, concentration camps, extermination camps with the skull and crossbones. 12 million people were killed in the Holocaust, about half of them Jews. The other half were Roma, gypsies you might call, and trade unionists, union leaders, socialists, communists. A lot of people were seen as the enemies of the Nazis. But the Jews were the particular target, were the favorite target, we could say. And when these camps were liberated, and Europe saw what had happened in these camps, there were many reasons, we could say, but it really lent a lot of weight to the Jewish problem and solving the Jewish problem by finding a homeland for all of these displaced people. They tried to send some Jews, settle them back in areas of Poland, and there was still trouble. People were still being attacked. So Europe, and I think there's also an element in which Europeans felt guilty about having not sort of made interventions, not bombed the tracks, not tried to disrupt the genocide. But Europeans and many Jews said there has to be a Jewish home. So it lent great weight to the Zionist movement, and after World War II, the idea of not supporting the Jewish homeland was at that point starting to seem like some kind of treasonous idea. Right? Zionism really became a much more popular idea.
You may have said this, but prior to the Holocaust, why were the British so invested in supporting Israel as a state?
Well, it's a great question. The British were a colonial empire, and the British had an interest in growing that empire and expanding that empire. And Jews were had been for many years seen as the potential agents of the British Empire. Right? That's what I said. In 1840, the British went and said, why don't you move there? And you read the article in 1840, it's like very clear. You will move there because our enemy is Muhammad Ali in Egypt, and you guys will be like our agents in Palestine to help us so that the French don't get it. Okay? And, there's a lot of history here. Crimean War, 1850s. Heard of the Crimean War? Florence Nightingale? It's in Crimea. It's not on this map, but it's like Ukraine. It's like almost like Russia. But this war in the 1850s, French, Russians, Ottomans, they all got into it saying they're going to protect the minorities. And the Russians said, we're going into the Ottoman Empire to protect the Orthodox Christians. And the French said, we're going to go in and protect the Catholics. And the British said, well, there's no Anglicans there. So, the Jews, but, and they started to build that as their local agents, right? And if they're a minority in the region, then they need the empire. And that relationship is one that you can use if you're the empire, right? And the French did the same thing with Maronite Christians in Lebanon. They cut it away from Syria, and they set it up as a Christian Lebanese country, dominated country. And just with the idea that they are going to be the local majority, but in the region they're a minority, and they'll always need the French to back them up. So they'll do our bidding. Okay? Good question. All right. So the Holocaust really sent a lot of support for Zionism among Jews in the diaspora and among European powers. The British could not handle the situation. They had been so decimated by the war, been bombed out by Nazis. And they handed it over to the newly created UN, and the UN decided to partition the land of Palestine again, and they said that they would make an Arab state in these black areas, right, and a Jewish state in these yellow areas. And Jerusalem would be a sort of international zone. And the Zionist movement, so that gave the Jewish homeland about 52% of the land. The Zionist movement said, that's a great deal. That is a great deal. At the time, they had about 300,000 people, 300,000 Jews in the land. There were about 650,000, round numbers, non-Jews, Arab population, mostly Muslims, some Christians. And they said, this is a great deal. We get more than 50%, we don't yet have that population, and we get some prime real estate. This whole area here, am I getting this? From Haifa down to Tel Aviv, Jaffa. These are, first of all, some of the main cities, the main ports, and the coastal plain here. That was some of the prime property. This central area is really hilly, and where a lot of Palestinians live. But it's not as good as coastal plains when it comes to agriculture. Up in the north, they got some great agricultural area around the Sea of Galilee. This lower part wasn't so good. It's mostly desert. But it was a really good deal for the Zionist movement, and they said yes. The Palestinian national movement said, this is a lousy deal. We got the majority population, and we're getting less of the land, 48, 49%, and not to mention that, but most of our Palestinian population, so many are living in these areas along the coastal plains, so many villages. What's going to happen to those folks? Are they going to be a minority in a Jewish state, or are they going to have to leave and become in the Palestinian state? And the Palestinian movement rejected this and said, this is a terrible deal. This is a colonial state you're setting up in our midst. Now let me just give you a sense here as we're looking at this map. That map, the size of the whole Palestine mandate at that point, it's about the size of Jersey, about New Jersey. So it's about 8,000 square miles. It's a little less if you don't have the West Bank, and I'll talk West. I haven't introduced West Bank yet. It's about the size of Jersey. So it's about there's 40, 60 miles that shows you. So it's like 60 miles going this way, right? And it's not a lot. It takes about an hour to drive across it, depending on the road you take. All right? Now, the Zionist movement accepted this deal. The Palestinian movement saw it as a terrible deal, and to make, again, painting in broad brushes, the Zionist leadership declared independence, and they had been scrambling, they had been fighting on the ground, struggling for areas, local Palestinian villages with a very well-organized Zionist army that had sort of got its start in World War I. I showed you that picture earlier with the Jewish brigade, and was internationally organized in many ways, and had connections in Europe and in the United States, and they started to strategically get main roads and build quick wall and tower settlements in extended areas to put facts on the ground of where Jewish settlement was. And in May of 48, they declared